Okay, so let's dive into this public procurement thing in Trinidad and Tobago. We've got a lot of material here.
Yeah.
We've got the 2015 Act, we've got amendments, and a whole bunch of regulations, guidelines, even a handbook.
Right.
So our mission is to see if this system actually does what it's supposed to do
Mm-hmm.
and how it compares to what other countries are doing.
Yeah, it's really interesting just looking at the objectives of the act itself.
Okay.
They're really ambitious.
Yeah.
It's not just about spending money. It's about making sure that the public has trust in how the government handles public funds.
Okay.
So we're talking accountability, transparency value for money, fairness, and even local industry development.
Yeah, that's quite the list. It's a tall order.
It is.
So are they actually pulling it off?
Well, the system definitely looks comprehensive on paper.
Okay.
I mean, just the number of different procurement methods that they have from, just open bidding to those specialized two-stage RFPs shows that they've really thought about how to tailor their approach to the complexity of what they're buying. Imagine needing to buy like 10,000 pens versus having to build a whole new hospital.
Yeah.
Those are two very different things requiring very different strategies.
Absolutely. I noticed something about the thresholds,
Yes.
those dollar amounts that tell you which method you should be using.
Right?
They're not actually fixed, are they?
No, they're not.
It seems like individual entities can set their own.
They can.
Doesn't that seem like it could get kind of messy?
It does raise a really important question about consistency.
Yeah.
If every ministry or agency has their own way of doing things, how can we be sure that everyone's actually following the same rules?
Right.
And more importantly, does it create loopholes
Yeah.
that could erode that public trust that the act is trying to build?
Right. Okay, so I'm starting to see where some of the potential issues could be.
Mm-hmm.
Even with all these thresholds and different methods, how do they make sure that they're not giving contracts to people who aren't qualified? It's not like just anyone can come off the street and say, hey, I can build a bridge, right?
Well, exactly. So there's this system of pre-qualification.
Okay.
You can kind of think of it as a vetting process, almost like a background check for the suppliers. They're looking at their financial stability, their technical expertise, their relevant experience. You wouldn't want somebody designing a school who's never worked on a building before.
That's true. And I saw that there's this database of pre-qualified suppliers.
Yes.
So it seems like once you're on that list, you're good to go.
Well, not so fast.
Okay.
What's really interesting here is that pre-qualification isn't a guarantee.
Mm-hmm.
They still have to do their due diligence before they award a contract to someone,
Okay.
which really helps protect against just rubber stamping someone based on their past performance. So it's a way of making sure that there's continuous scrutiny, even for those suppliers who have been deemed reliable.
Right. That's a good extra layer of protection against things going wrong. So let's say they've narrowed it down to a few potential bidders. How do they actually pick the winner? Is it just whoever has the lowest price?
Well, it's tempting to think that, but it's actually much more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
Their evaluation process considers what they call non-price factors.
Okay.
For example, let's say one company has a lot more experience in a specific type of construction. They might choose them even if their bid is a little bit higher because they're trying to get the best value for money, which isn't always the same as the cheapest option.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's almost like choosing a doctor.
Right.
You might not just choose the doctor with the lowest consultation fee. You're going to look at their experience. You can look at their success rate, things like that.
Precisely. That's a great analogy.
So they're weighing the price against the quality, the expertise, the track record.
Yeah. And now imagine this scenario. You get a bid and it's suspiciously low.
Oh, okay.
Almost too good to be true. Red flag. Right. It makes you wonder if they can actually deliver on that without cutting corners or maybe doing something even worse.
Exactly. I'd want to investigate.
That's exactly what they do. That's what the Act calls for.
Okay.
An investigation into what they call abnormally low bids.
Yeah.
It's all about making sure that the bidder can actually do the job without compromising on quality or safety or ethical standards.
So it's like this balancing act of getting a good deal.
Right.
But also making sure that it's a legitimate deal and that it's a responsible deal.
Exactly.
Once the contract is signed, though, is that the end of the story?
Not at all. One of the things that I found really interesting while I was looking through all of these documents is how much they emphasize ongoing contract management.
Okay.
It's not just about awarding a contract and walking away.
Right.
It's about continuously monitoring performance, managing any risks that might come up,
Hmm.
and making sure that the project actually delivers what it's supposed to deliver.
So it's not a set it and forget it type of thing. There's active involvement from the very beginning all the way through to the end.
Exactly. It's like having a garden, you know? You don't just plant the seeds and walk away.
Right.
You have to nurture it, you have to weed it, you have to make adjustments along the way to make sure that you get a successful harvest.
So we talked about how they choose the winner,
Yeah.
how they manage that process. But what about when a project is finished or they need to get rid of old equipment?
Right.
How do they handle that?
Well, that's also covered in the Act, the disposal of public property.
Okay.
And here's where we can see just how comprehensive the system really is.
Hmm.
It's not just about buying things, it's also about managing them and then eventually disposing of them.
Yep.
We're talking everything from basic supplies to specialized equipment, even things like intangible assets like software licenses.
Intangible assets.
Yeah.
That's an interesting one. I guess those can be just as valuable as physical items these days.
Absolutely.
Do they have guidelines for that as well?
They do. You know, I was surprised to find that there are specific guidelines for storing even things like pharmaceuticals,
Wow.
which just shows how thorough and detailed this system is.
So they really have thought of everything.
They've tried to.
We've talked about a lot of these mechanisms that are designed to make the system work.
Yeah.
But what about training for the people who are actually doing this work?
Yeah.
The procurement officers.
Yeah.
Seems like a pretty demanding job.
It is. And the documents clearly show that they are committed to capacity building.
Okay.
You know, they've created training programs, a competency framework.
Mm-hmm.
They even have an online learning management system.
That's impressive.
Yeah, it shows that they recognize that this system can only be successful if they have skilled and knowledgeable people running it.
So it's not just about having rules on paper.
No.
It's about investing in the people who are going to make those rules a reality.
Exactly. And this is where it becomes really interesting to compare their system to what other countries are doing. Because while a lot of countries have some kind of rules and regulations around public procurement,
Right.
the level of detail and the emphasis on training that we're seeing in Trinidad and Tobago is actually quite advanced.
So they're ahead of the curve in some ways?
It seems that way. But even with all these mechanisms in place, I'm sure there are going to be challenges and inconsistencies.
Okay, well, lay it on me. What are some of the potential weaknesses that you see?
One thing that jumps out at me is that some of the language in the regulations is kind of vague,
Okay.
and that lack of clarity could lead to inconsistencies in how the rules are actually applied across different entities.
Right.
You know, those varying thresholds that we talked about. That's one example where things could potentially get a bit messy.
So a lack of clarity could actually end up undermining the accountability and the trust that the Act is trying to build.
Exactly. And then there's also the potential for conflicts of interest,
Okay.
especially because of how decentralized the system is.
Mm.
They have tried to address this, but there's always room for improvement when it comes to preventing even just the appearance of favoritism or bias.
So tighter controls, clearer language, ongoing scrutiny. It seems like those are all really important.
They are. And one more thing, I think they could be doing more in terms of collecting and analyzing data.
Okay.
You know, they need to be asking themselves, is the system actually working? Are they getting value for money? Are they actually helping to develop local industries?
Right.
Having that kind of data will help them make better decisions about where to focus their efforts.
So it's like having a roadmap.
Exactly.
You need to know where you've been and where you're going if you want to figure out the best way forward.
Exactly. And it all comes back to that idea of public trust.
Mm-hmm.
The more transparent and data-driven the system is, the more confidence people will have in how their money is being spent.
Okay, so we've gone from the big ambitious goals of the Act all the way to the potential pitfalls that could derail its success.
Yes.
But we've really just scratched the surface here.
We have.
There's still so much to unpack, especially when it comes to those specific regulations and guidelines that actually make this system work. So stay with us as we continue our deep dive into public procurement in Trinidad and Tobago.
Yes, and remember, understanding how the system works gives you the power to ask the right questions.
Absolutely.
And to hold those in power accountable.
Coming up next, we're going to take a closer look at those regulations.
Okay.
That's where things get really interesting.
Yeah. Welcome back. So now that we've kind of laid the groundwork, let's really get into those regulations and guidelines.
Okay.
You know, the ones that actually put meat on the bones of this whole procurement system. It's where all those finer points really come to life.
All right. I'm ready for the nitty-gritty.
Yeah.
What stands out to you as we go deeper?
Well, one of the first things I noticed was the sheer number of standardized forms.
Okay.
It seems like they have a form for absolutely everything.
Forms, forms, forms. Sounds a little bit bureaucratic to me.
It might seem that way at first, but it's actually a really smart way to try to address those inconsistencies we talked about earlier.
Okay.
Having these standardized forms means that everyone's following the same procedures.
Right.
They're using the same language and they're documenting everything clearly.
So again, it comes back to building that trust.
Exactly.
If everything is documented
Yeah.
and it's all transparent, then there's less chance for things to get lost in translation or for decisions to be made behind closed doors.
Precisely. It creates a level playing field for everyone involved.
Huh.
And speaking of transparency, the regulations also have very specific requirements for record keeping.
Okay.
Every single step of the process has to be properly documented, and those records have to be accurate and up to date.
Sounds like a ton of paperwork.
It is, but it doesn't have to be a burden because the regulations actually allow for electronic record keeping,
Okay.
which can actually make the whole process much more efficient and accessible.
Oh.
Think of it as like a searchable digital filing cabinet. Anyone who needs to access that information can do so really easily.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So they're using technology to their advantage here to make things more transparent and efficient.
Exactly.
But who's actually making sure that all these rules and regulations are being followed? Is it just up to the Office of Procurement Regulation?
Well, the OPR definitely plays a key role in oversight.
Okay.
But there's also this important internal mechanism within each procuring entity.
Okay.
It's called the Procurement and Disposal Advisory Committee, or PDC for short.
The PDC.
Yes. And they're the ones who are responsible for reviewing procurement proceedings, making recommendations, and just generally making sure that everything's being done by the book.
So it's not just a top-down approach.
Right.
There's this internal layer of accountability as well.
Exactly. But what happens when things go wrong?
Okay.
You know, we talked about those legal cases earlier. Are there any ways to handle disputes or challenges?
Yeah, that's a good question.
There are, and this is where something called the standstill period comes into play.
The standstill period. I don't remember seeing that term in the materials.
Yeah, it's actually outlined in a separate guideline, the General Guidelines Standstill Period.
Okay.
Essentially, it's a period of time after a contract has been awarded where unsuccessful bidders can actually challenge the decision.
So it's like a chance to appeal if they feel like the process wasn't fair.
Exactly. It's a really important safeguard against potential bias or errors in how the bids were evaluated. During that standstill period, unsuccessful bidders can actually request a debriefing.
Okay.
They can get more information about why their bid wasn't chosen, and they can even file a formal complaint with the OPR if they think that there were legitimate grounds for a challenge.
So it's like a safety valve in case something went wrong.
Yes. But you might be thinking, doesn't this standstill period cause delays and maybe disrupt the whole procurement process?
Yeah, that was my next question.
And it's a valid concern.
Yes.
The guideline actually addresses that. There are exceptions to when the standstill period might not apply. For example, if there's an emergency procurement or if there are national security concerns.
So they've built in some flexibility
Right.
to make sure that things that are essential can keep moving forward.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between fairness and efficiency.
Okay.
Now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about something that we mentioned earlier, sustainable procurement.
Okay.
It's not just about getting the cheapest deal, it's about making choices that are actually good for the environment and for society as a whole.
Right. We talked about how sustainability comes into play with disposal of public property.
Mm-hmm.
But how does it actually factor into the procurement process itself?
Well, they actually have a specific guideline dedicated to this, the General Guidelines Sustainable Development and Sustainable Procurement.
Okay.
And it encourages those procuring entities to really think about the environmental and social and economic impact of their decisions.
So how would that look in practice?
Well, they might give preference to bidders who are offering energy-efficient products or using recycled materials, or who have strong environmental and social responsibility policies in place.
So they're using their purchasing power to incentivize these sustainable practices.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just the products themselves.
Okay.
They're also promoting sustainable practices throughout the entire procurement process.
Like what?
So things like reducing waste using electronic communication instead of paper, and making sure that there are fair labor practices within their supply chains.
So they're really taking this comprehensive approach,
They are.
looking at the entire life cycle of a product or service.
But I'm curious, how do they actually measure whether these sustainable procurement efforts are working?
Yeah. Good question.
And it's a great question because it gets to the heart of one of the challenges that we've already identified,
Okay.
the need for better data collection and analysis.
Right.
While they're definitely making an effort to incorporate sustainability into the process,
Yep.
they really need to be tracking their progress and measuring their impact.
So what does that look like?
It's about asking questions like, are they actually reducing waste?
Yeah.
Are they seeing more bids from suppliers who have strong sustainability practices?
Right.
That's the kind of data that can help answer those questions and inform better decision-making in the future.
So it's about going beyond just good intentions.
Right.
And actually showing the tangible benefits
Yeah.
of these sustainable procurement efforts.
Exactly. And using that data to refine the system,
Okay.
figure out where they can improve, and make the case for even more investment in these sustainable practices.
Now, what about risk assessment and management? We haven't really touched on that yet.
Ah, yes, risk assessment. That's another fascinating aspect of these regulations.
Risk assessment. It sounds kind of intense. What kind of risks are we talking about here?
Well, it's not just about financial risks.
Okay.
They're looking at things like reputational risk, operational risk,
Yeah.
even environmental and social risks.
Could you give me an example?
Yeah, sure.
Oh.
So they might assess the risk of a supplier maybe engaging in unethical labor practices,
Wow.
or maybe the risk of a project having a negative impact on the community around it.
So they're thinking holistically.
Yes.
They're not just looking at the bottom line.
Exactly. And that's a really important part of responsible procurement. They've actually developed a pretty detailed framework for identifying, analyzing, and then mitigating these risks at every stage of the process.
It sounds pretty sophisticated.
It is. And it really underscores how important it is to have skilled procurement officers, people who can understand and apply this risk assessment framework. It's not just a matter of ticking boxes.
Right.
It requires judgment expertise and a really deep understanding of the project in the context that it's happening in.
I'm thinking back to those legal cases that we discussed.
Mm-hmm.
I bet some of those could have been avoided if they'd done proper risk assessment and management.
You're probably right.
Mm.
If they'd identified those potential problems early on, they could have saved themselves a lot of trouble down the line.
Exactly.
And those cases also highlight another really important element of the regulations pre-qualification of suppliers.
Right. We talked about that before. It's
Yeah.
about vetting those suppliers.
Yes.
Making sure they have the experience and the capacity to actually do the job.
Exactly. And there's actually a whole regulation dedicated to that process, the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Pre-Qualification and Pre-Selection Regulations of 2021.
Catchy title.
Yeah. It lays out all the criteria for pre-qualification, the application process, and the ongoing due diligence that needs to happen even after a supplier has been pre-qualified.
So they're really hammering home that point that pre-qualification isn't a free pass.
Exactly. There's continuous scrutiny throughout the entire process.
Okay.
And again, it all comes back to that theme of trust.
Mm-hmm.
By being really thorough and transparent in how they choose their suppliers, they're building confidence in the integrity of the whole system.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. We've got forms for consistency, record keeping for transparency, the standstill period for fairness, risk assessment for responsible decision-making, and pre-qualification for making sure that you've got capable suppliers. It's
Exactly.
a complex system,
It is.
but it seems like they've put a lot of thought into making it work.
They have, and that's what I find so interesting about it. You know, it's not a perfect system,
Right.
but it's one that's constantly evolving.
Yeah.
They're learning from their mistakes, they're refining their approach, and they're really trying to achieve those ambitious goals that they set out in the Act.
So even with all these regulations and guidelines, there's still that human element,
Absolutely.
that human judgment and decision-making involved.
Yes. And that's why training and capacity building are so important.
Right.
They need to have skilled procurement professionals who can navigate this complex system, make sound judgments, and uphold those principles of fairness, transparency, and accountability.
It sounds like a challenging but really important job.
It is. And in the final part of our deep dive, we're going to explore those challenges in a lot more detail. We'll look at some of those real-world legal cases. We'll examine the OPR's role in resolving those disputes. And we'll think about how the system could be strengthened even further to really make sure it's serving the people of Trinidad and Tobago.
I can't wait to get into those cases.
Yeah.
I think they're going to give us a really good glimpse into how the system operates in practice and where some of those pressure points might be. Okay, so we spent the last two parts really getting deep into this public procurement system in Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah.
We've got the act, we've got the regulations, we've got all the guidelines. It's like we have the whole blueprint laid out in front of us.
We do.
But now it's time to see how this actually works in the real world.
Right.
And I think these legal cases we have
Yeah.
are going to be really revealing.
Definitely.
They're going to show us where the system works well and where there might be some cracks.
You know what I find really interesting about these cases is that they're not just these abstract legal arguments.
Right.
These are stories about real people, real businesses, real money.
Yeah.
And they really highlight that human element of this whole system. The fact that mistakes can happen, misunderstandings can happen, and sometimes even deliberate wrongdoing.
Okay, well, let's not waste any more time. Let's jump right in. What's the first case on our list?
Okay, so let's start with CP 2024-14.
Okay.
This case involves a company that bid on a consultancy contract, and they felt that the evaluation process wasn't fair.
Okay.
They were arguing that the government agency actually changed the criteria after the bids were submitted,
Oh.
which put them at a disadvantage.
So it's a question of transparency and consistency, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It all goes back to what we were talking about earlier about
Yeah.
how important it is for everyone to be playing by the same rules.
So what happened?
Well, the Office of Procurement Regulation actually reviewed this case,
Okay.
and they sided with the applicant.
Okay.
They basically said, yeah, the agency didn't follow the right procedures.
So they messed up.
They did, and they were told to reevaluate the bids using the original criteria
Yep.
to make sure that there was a fair outcome.
So there are ways to fix these kinds of errors.
Yeah.
But I imagine these disputes can be pretty costly
Oh, absolutely.
and time-consuming for everyone involved.
Yes, and that's why it's so important to get it right the first time.
Right.
These cases aren't just about legal technicalities. They have real consequences for businesses
Yeah.
and, in the end, for public trust in the system as a whole.
Okay, that's a good point. What's the next case?
All right, so let's look at CP 2024-22.
Okay.
This one involves a construction company,
Okay.
and their bid was a lot lower than all the others.
Okay.
And the agency thought, this seems a little suspicious.
Yeah.
This might be what we call an abnormally low bid.
Red flag.
Exactly. Maybe a sign that they're going to cut corners.
Yeah.
So they just rejected it outright without even investigating further.
Wait a minute. Didn't we say that they're supposed to investigate those abnormally low bids?
Yes.
And give the bidder a chance to explain their pricing?
You are absolutely right, and that's exactly what the construction company argued. They said, hey, we should have been given a chance to explain why our price is so low.
Yeah.
And the OPR agreed with them.
Oh, wow.
They said the agency didn't handle that properly.
Okay.
And this really shows how important it is to follow the established procedures, even when you think someone might be trying to pull a fast one.
So it's a delicate balance, right?
It is.
You have to protect yourself from risky bids.
Yes.
But you also have to be fair and give everyone a chance.
Exactly. You have to make sure there's due process. And these cases really show how those technical details that we talked about, like the rules for handling abnormally low bids, they have real consequences for the businesses involved.
I was seeing how these legal battles really expose the pressure points within the system. What's next?
Okay, so CP 2024-26. This one takes us to the world of requests for quotations,
Okay.
which is a more simplified method for buying things that aren't as expensive.
Right.
But even with a simpler process, things can still go wrong. In this case, a securities services company felt that they were unfairly evaluated.
What happened?
They said that the agency used criteria that wasn't clearly stated in the request for quotations,
Oh.
which put them at a disadvantage.
So even with a simpler process, the transparency and clear communication is still crucial.
Absolutely. And the OPR agreed. They said the agency should have been more clear about their requirements.
Okay.
And it just reinforces the idea that these principles of fairness and transparency, they apply across the board no matter how big or small the purchase is.
Okay. I'm noticing a theme here. It seems like the key takeaways from these cases are being consistent with the rules, communicating clearly, making sure everyone has a level playing field.
You got it. And our final case, CP 2024-28, this one deals with one of the most sensitive issues in procurement conflicts of interest.
Oh, yeah.
In this case, an insurance brokerage firm claimed that the contract was awarded to a company that had close ties to someone on the board of the awarding authority.
It's not what you know, it's who you know, right?
Right. That was the allegation. So the OPR did a thorough investigation.
Okay.
They looked at documents, they interviewed people, and they determined whether there was any actual wrongdoing.
And do they have the power to do anything? if they find something?
They do. They can impose some pretty serious penalties if they find evidence of conflicts of interest,
Right.
which helps to make sure the system stays fair and unbiased.
So it's not just about having the rules, it's about actually enforcing them.
Exactly. And these cases really show that the OPR takes its job as watchdog seriously.
Okay, we've gone through 4 very different cases.
Yeah.
Each one has given us a different perspective on the procurement system. If we had to boil it all down to the most important takeaways, what would you say?
Well, I think it all comes back to those core principles that are laid out in the 2015 Act.
Okay.
Fairness, transparency, accountability, and value for money.
Right.
These cases really show how important it is to stick to those principles.
In every decision, in every interaction, in every step of the process.
Exactly. And it's not just about the OPR either, right?
Everyone who's involved, the procurement officers, the bidders, even the public, everyone has a role to play in making sure that this system works the way it should.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, right?
Yeah.
The more people understand about the system, the more they can hold it accountable.
Exactly.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
We started with a mountain of documents.
That's for sure.
And I think we managed to find some really valuable insights about how this system is designed to work and how it actually works in practice.
Yeah.
We've seen the good stuff, the comprehensive regulations, the focus on training, the commitment to sustainability, but we've also seen where things could be better, like the vague language, the potential for conflicts of interest, and the need for better data analysis.
And those legal cases were so helpful.
They were.
They gave us a real glimpse into the consequences of the system's successes and failures.
Exactly. It's a complicated system. There's always room for improvement. But at the end of the day, it's all about making sure that public money is used responsibly, ethically, and effectively for the benefit of the people of Trinidad and Tobago.
It's an important topic, and I hope this deep dive has given you the tools to ask the right questions.
Yeah.
To engage with the process, and maybe even to be a part of shaping its future.
I hope so too. Thanks for joining us.
And until next time, keep learning and keep exploring.